Hey pals, you've probably noticed the name of our podcast and our logo is different today. So before we dive into the episode, we just want to explain why. We were contacted by a company in the US that felt our podcast name and logo infringed on their registered trademarks. Despite how we feel about this claim, Katie and I made the decision to move away from our previous name, Alpaca My Bags, and our previous logo.
Moving forward, we are now Curious Tourism, the responsible travel podcast. Don't worry, this doesn't change anything about the content that we make. We're still focused on making episodes about how travel can be better for people and the planet. So, if you want to show support for our new name and look, feel free to share us on social media or tell a friend about us. We're super excited to embrace this new name, and we hope you are too.
For the last few years, Katie and I have been unpacking tourism to try to understand how travel can be better for people and for the planet. And in this time, one thing has become very clear. There are several inconvenient truths when it comes to the travel industry. In 2021, a documentary came out that addresses those inconvenient truths. The Last Tourist explores the benefits and the harms of tourism, as well as the myriad of social issues that factor into the current tourism landscape. Ultimately, the film argues that tourism has reached a tipping point. Today on Curious Tourism, the Responsible Travel Podcast, we're chatting with Tyson Sadler, the director behind The Last Tourist. Tyson shares with us some of the themes that come up in the film, like why we need to address value chains in tourism, and he also shares his thoughts on the state of tourism, what needs to change for a better tourism future.
Is this the first time that you've listened to Curious Tourism, the Responsible Travel Podcast? If so, make sure that you've hit the follow button right now on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app, because there is plenty more to come this season.
If you want to get in touch with us, you can find us on Instagram at Curious Tourism Pod. You can DM us or email us anytime. All of our contact info is in the episode description. Okay, so we have some exciting news to share with all of you travel pals. Also, is it awkward that I just made the executive decision to move from Alpaca Pal to Travel Pals? I was like, easy transition.
I think that's fine.
Okay. Katie,
yes.
We have an exciting announcement.
We do.
The day has finally come that you and I are going to fly to another country together. I've been waiting for this moment for literally more than 4 years now. So I'm so excited.
We have done all the travel things so far that include Ontario.
Yes. We have road tripped a lot, but it's time for us
to hit the skies.
Yes. Okay. And travel pals, you are also invited,
Woo-hoo!
Which is really exciting. We are collaborating on a group trip with Origin Travels. They are a locally owned group tour agency here in Toronto. And we have had the founder of Origin on our show. And over the years, we've just really enjoyed supporting them as they grow. They've always supported us. We started out around the same time, which was really cute. So yeah, we're excited to share that we're going to be going together on one of their group trips, and all of you travel pals are invited to come with us.
All of you. Every single one.
Actually, there's a cap, 10 people max. The tour will be small groups, so 6 to 10 people, and 2 of those people will be us. And just to clarify, we will not be your tour guides because Katie and I are not qualified for that, but we will be enthusiastically participating in the tour. And I'll just make it my mission to find all the cute dogs and cats for us to pet.
Yes. Well,
I'll be the first to pet just to make sure.
I was going to say, I'll make it my mission to tell you all to not pet it, to ignore Erin.
Don't do as I do. Wait, we haven't even said where the tour is.
No, we didn't. Erin, where are we going?
We're going to Guatemala. I'm really excited because I've been there before. And as everyone knows, I love going back to places that I've already been because it's just double the fun when you're returning. I'm excited to go back a couple years later. I'm sure I'll learn lots of new things and it'll be your first experience.
I'm so excited because I've been wanting to go since I've read your volcano blog and I was like, I need to go.
We're going to hike a volcano. Like, caveat, this is like an add-on. You can add on to the tour if you want. You can do a little volcano hike. Obviously, easy stuff for me. I will be doing it. You will be as well, Katie. You have no choice. But anyone
I'll bring
else
my
who signs
inhaler.
up, anyone else who signs up can choose to do or to pass. Totally up to you. And yeah, do you want to tell us about the guide for this tour group?
Yes. Okay. So our guide will be Nancy. She was born and raised in Guatemala and has led all of the Origin Travels group trips to Guatemala. So she'll be a part of every day and will be showing us her home country and sharing her perspectives and answering all of our questions as we travel.
Yeah, I'm super excited to meet Nancy. And yeah, something else that I'm really excited about for this trip is that we're going to host a virtual or in person, for anyone who is in the Toronto area, meetup before the trip. We're going to do like a 1 to 2 hour session where we will all complete together a short course by the Rise Travel Institute that covers conscious travel in Guatemala. So the course covers a brief history of Guatemala, current issues, cultural do's and don'ts, and much more. And we thought this would be a fun, like, pre-departure activity that we can do all together, can help us all get to know each other before the trip, and then we can all go into the trip with some solid knowledge of how to be a conscious tourist in Guatemala.
Mm-hmm. And Rise is also Vinci Ho's company, who will be joining us later this season, which I'm so excited for because that conversation is so good.
Yeah, she's great. The trip is going to be November 18 to 24. And if you want to join us, you can go to the link in our episode notes to learn more about the trip and to reserve your spot. Anyways, what are you most excited for in Guatemala?
Well, I mentioned the volcano, but I also mentioned to you before we started recording that I also had to take a puff of my inhaler. So I'm a bit nervous. I just need to work on my lung capacity, I think, before we get there. And also, is there altitude sickness when you go up the volcano? Is that something to worry about? I
don't think we're going to do the one I did. That is the really intense one. We'll probably do Pacaya, which is a shorter volcano.
Less tall volcano?
Less tall volcano. Less altitude.
Yes.
But we can definitely come prepared with some medication to take before, just in case. Because to be honest, everyone's really different and you never know how it'll impact you. I was kind of surprised at how quickly I felt the impact of altitude sickness. And there's one we can do because the tour does go to Lake Atitlan, which is a gorgeous region of Guatemala. And there's a really fun sunrise hike you can do there. Ooh. That is tough because you're doing it at 4 a.m. in the dark, but you don't go to a really high altitude and you are rewarded with the most beautiful sunrise and fresh tea and coffee on the top of a mountain. So we're definitely doing that. And I think that one's pretty I would say it's pretty entry level. You just got to gear up for 30 minutes of difficultness. And once you get through it, you're okay.
Wear comfortable shoes. You'll be good. It'll all be worth it in the end. I'm very excited for that because I love a sunrise and I love a sunset. I am that annoying person. Literally, I think probably every single night when there is a sunset at home, I'm like, Mark, look at the beautiful sunset outside. He's like, yeah. Well, look at the beautiful sunset. He's like, there was one last night too. I'm like, I don't care. It's gorgeous. I love a sunset and I love a sunrise. I am all about this.
I would argue that sunrises hit different because you have to force yourself to wake up for them. So they're more of a treat because you don't see them all the time.
Yes, totally. I'm pumped.
I hate getting up really early in the morning. So I'll be miserable, but it'll be worth it.
We'll be grumpy together because I used to think that I was a morning person. This is not true.
We'll
all do our best.
We'll see what happens because sometimes when I travel, I don't know what it is. When we were in Belize last fall, I was waking up at 6 a.m. naturally every day. I literally went and watched the sunrise every day because for some reason I just woke up early. I think it might be because during the day, unlike at home, you're outside, you're in the sun, you're doing things all day. So Luke and I were always in bed by 9 o'clock, which is unusual for me at home. But when I'm traveling, I'm just so pooped by the end of the day. So it's easier to get to sleep early and wake up with the sun.
I also think that when you're traveling, you're just less stressed out than you normally are. And so Your sleep feels like you're more well rested and you're excited to wake up the next morning. You're not like tired, or maybe you're a little tired or maybe even a little hungover, but you're still down to wake up and you're like excited for the next day, which is tough, Capitalism sucks. So we all do our best, but I think in travel it'll be easy because also we'll be with a group too. So we'll all be like encouraging each other to just get up really early and just do it.
Yeah. Okay, there's one fear I have
about
going back to Guatemala, specifically to Lake Atitlan, because as you know, I was bitten by a cat there. And I just the lifespan of cats, it could very much still be alive. And I know exactly where it will be. And I know exactly what it looks like. I have photos of this cat. And I'm worried that I'm going to see this cat and it's going to be like, it's you. And come after me again.
How many years has it been?
This was 2018 that this cat and I first had a bad encounter. It'll be older.
Yeah. It's going to be senile too.
No, I was hoping the cats get less vicious in their old age.
Oh no, I guess we're going to find out.
But this cat lives in this restaurant. So I just know if we go to this restaurant, it's going to be there.
And it's going to bite you again?
I don't know.
Because if you don't pet it, you might avoid that.
Yeah. Yeah, so excited, and I hope that some of you travel pals will come and join us.
Yes.
It's going to be really fun.
Yes, and if you have any questions about the tour as well, definitely reach out to Origin Travels, and they can answer them for you. We want you to be there more than anything, so ask all the questions you need.
Yeah.
All right, Erin, should we talk to Tyson?
Yeah, let's do it. Super excited to be connecting with you, Tyson. Big fan of the film, and was really excited. I watched the film not realizing it was made by Canadians. So that was a really pleasant surprise.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me today. I'm really happy to sit down with you.
And also just need to plug, it was really fun to see our friend show up in the credits roll. Katie, did you catch that? Emily Scott is in the credits.
I did not catch that. That's amazing.
Yeah.
Emily.
She is a friend of ours and she has come on our podcast twice. So that was really exciting to see. To start, I'm curious about how you became invested in talking about how and why tourism needs to change. Was there an aha moment for you that made you look at travel more responsibly?
Yeah, well, the creation of this film didn't happen all at once. I've worked in the travel sector for the last 20 years, and I've also worked as a journalist, traveling to some very remote, isolated, and fragile parts of the world. And in the winter of 2018, our executive producer approached myself, to direct a film somewhere, in the space of responsible tourism. And in seeing, how we as travelers interact with the world around us, how we interact with, other communities, and how we interact with wildlife, and how we interact with the environment, through our conversations with our executive producer, it kind of became evident that, the right course of action, if we were going to embark on a film like this, was to create a film which served as an inconvenient truth for the travel industry. Something that tackled a lot of the difficult questions and, difficult ethical concerns within the industry, pulled back the curtains, and, kind of allowed us as travelers to realize the full impact of our decisions. And, so what began in January of 2018, actually, was the initial steps of a 4-year journey, which took us around the world to 17 different countries. In conversations with, some of the world's foremost experts in travel, and also some, many, many people on the ground level, who were working in tourism, who, were exploited by tourism, and also people who were leveraging tourism, as a way to improve, situations in their impoverished communities, and also build a better life for themselves, also enact, change, positive change on the environment and also wildlife.
I'm curious, as someone who's worked in this space for so long, sort of challenging the way that we travel, what's your take on how, I hate the word mainstream, but how common knowledge would you say it is? Because for Katie and I, watching your film, a lot of these issues were ones we're familiar with because we talk about them on the show, but it's sometimes hard in our own little bubble to know like what maybe the general public like knows about these issues. So I'm curious if you have a take on that as someone who writes about responsible tourism and has now made this film.
It's fascinating because a lot of these themes aren't necessarily new. You mentioned that you're kind of in a bubble, and I believe that I'm in that same bubble because some of these conversations have been had in certain circles for decades, 10, 20, 30 years. And people are still trying to enact some meaningful change. There's a movement, in the right direction, but it's just not there yet. But it's amazing to me, when we screen this film for people who aren't, part of this community, part of this bubble of people who have these conversations about social responsibility and environmentalism, on a regular basis. Many of these themes, people are still discovering them for the first time. And surprisingly, the vast majority of people are not thinking about the ethical impacts of our travel choices. And often when we travel, and I'll use a collective we, but often when we travel, it's like we suspend our values. We have a certain way that we act in our communities at home, and we have a certain way that we act among our friends, and and we have a certain social and environmental responsibility in our own communities. But it's amazing, when somebody books their all-inclusive down to Punta Cana, Dominican Republic, how a lot of those just very normal ethical parts of our lives, just in terms of recycling and how we interact with our neighbors, can just be put on a shelf and forgotten about for that week. In actuality, the impact of our choices have much greater consequences when we travel abroad, because abroad, it's specifically in developing countries, they don't have the infrastructure to handle poor decisions like we would in Canada or the US or in the UK. Poor choices have a much greater impact and a more negative impact on host communities, on the environment, and on wildlife.
Yeah, there's so much to unpack there. I mean, we talk all the time on this podcast about how like even people who have like quite a lot of awareness of social responsibility and travel will still travel in a sort of like a mind frame of it's just for leisure. I think it's like really easy to separate like travel from social responsibility because we associate it so much with leisure. And then like that just brings me to, okay, well, we live in a capitalist society. So like when you have 2 weeks vacation, of course, you're going to view those 2 weeks as leisure and not want to have to engage with like social responsibility and like just face the reality of your impact when you're just trying to recover from like the weight of capitalism.
I mean, and to piggyback on that, when the ultimate goal, in tourism is profits, those profits have a cost. And often the cost is the most fragile, in terms of, the poorest people, endangered wildlife, fragile environments.
And I really appreciated, like, I think the film does such a great job of showing you that. But yeah, just in case there's people listening who haven't seen The Last Tourist, the film explores the benefits, but also the harms of tourism, as well as the myriad of social issues that factor into the current tourism landscape. As a podcaster in this space, I know all too well how challenging it can be to talk about responsible tourism in a way that delves into the nuance of it. Katie and I have now made almost 100 episodes of this show, and we're still working through a long spreadsheet of topics that we need to talk about. So given that, I'm curious how you were able to decide like which issues or which stories were the most important to cover under the umbrella of responsible travel, because you only have like 90 minutes with the film. So how did you decide?
It was incredibly challenging. The umbrella of tourism is just so vast. People will watch the movie and, might think like, well, why didn't you cover, certain aspects? We don't cover sex tourism, and we don't cover, there's lots of different areas that certainly deserve, like their own film. And what we do in this film, is we scratch the surface, we dig a little deeper. But really, this film serves to spark some conversations, some difficult conversations about our relationship with travel. Upon completion of this film, what we realized is that, well, the next step is a 6-part, episodic on a streaming platform. And so in order to narrow down the themes that we wanted to cover in the film, the first 6 months, of this film was research and talking and having Zoom conversations with experts and tour operators, and just getting a finger on the pulse of what some of the biggest concerns were. We wanted to make a movie that had an appeal to a mass audience. We wanted to make a film that that served the traveler, that served just people like you and me who love to just put on a backpack and go traveling and explore. And so this film isn't made for destination management organizations or politicians or governments, although we would love them to watch it, and we certainly think that there's a lot to gain from it. But ultimately, the target audience in this film, people like myself who are travelers and backpackers who just love to go out and explore and have intercultural exchanges, with different parts of the world. What we realized, within that period of exploration is that we wanted to tackle, some of the more popular tourist activities, that had a greater impact, on the global, GDP in terms of tourism. And so we really narrowed it down to 3 major components: the environment, tourism's impact on wildlife, and most importantly, tourism's impact on host communities. And poverty alleviation is a big part of this. Recognizing also that tourism is a double-edged sword. That was the exploration that we needed to have. There's a positive and a negative in all of our decisions.
So the film touches on the impact of cruise ships and resorts. It talks about distribution of wealth in tourism, the rise of volunteerism, wildlife tourism, and much more. But I'm curious which of these tourism issues that you explored had the greatest impact on you. I know that you've worked in this area for quite a while, but was there any particular issue that you touched in the film that when you learned about it, you just felt it just had more of an impact on you compared to the others?
What's interesting about this film is that, it's certainly a reflection of my travel history, and it's a reflection of my travel experience. The negatives that we explore in the film, I'm the first to raise my hand and say that, at one time in my life, I was guilty. Cruise ships, guilty. Elephant riding, guilty. Volunteering in orphanages, guilty. All of those, had a significant impact on me. I'm a wildlife lover. My current travel choices, take me around the world, in search of large wildlife, and I love to photograph wildlife. With that in mind, one of the greatest aha moments that I had during the creation of this film was looking, at the elephant riding tourism in Thailand. 22 years ago, I took a trip to Thailand with a friend, and we rode elephants. And I had no idea at that time, the impact that tourism actually has on these elephants. There's, elephant tourism relies on a process called the pajan, which serves to break, the spirit of the elephant, both physically and mentally. And when we engage in tourist activities like elephant riding, we need to realize that when that elephant was a juvenile, it was likely separated from its mother, and it had its tail and legs and trunk, bound in a process called the pajan, which broke the spirit of this animal, which then allowed humans to ride it for the rest of its life. It's a devastating and cruel and horrible process, but it's also one that is supported by every tourist who rides an elephant. Seeing that, firsthand was a real moment, that really had an emotional impact on me.
I can relate to that because 7 years ago, I was in Cambodia and I knew not to ride elephants. This was becoming commonly talked about at that time. So I looked for a sanctuary to visit elephants. And I found one that I thought was reputable, and they might be, I really don't know, but I went, and part of the program was that you fed the elephants and you brought them into the water and washed them. And I've since learned, making this podcast, that actually any form of interaction is just a no, because any interaction that you have with that elephant, it's been trained to have with you. So I fully relate to this experience of just like learning as you go. And that shaped a lot of our show as well. Like a lot of the issues that we have tackled first are ones that I've like grappled with myself just through my own experiences traveling the world.
There's a constant state of greenwashing that happens in the travel industry. And I've learned, specifically whether you're in Cambodia or whether you're in Thailand, I've learned that a lot of the language around sustainable tourism is absolutely meaningless. And for example, when we go to Thailand or Cambodia, there's phrases that are used. You use the term sanctuary. There's retirement home. There's elephant orphanage. There's these words that, that companies use to mask the fact that, they're engaging in unethical behavior. But really, ultimately, it's just a change in branding, but the product is still the same. And we see that the same, in orphanage, in human orphanage, in orphanage tourism. There's certain language that's kind of become a dirty word, like orphanage has become a dirty word. And now, these purveyors of the orphanages, are now using terms like child center and, other words just to mask the negative connotations that have gone, with traditional language in these spaces.
Yeah, absolutely. It makes it really hard to actually figure out like what the right choice is.
I completely agree, and I've come to learn that there's a lot less ethical tourism happening and a lot more branding and marketing.
So one of the other themes that comes up throughout The Last Tourist is this idea of the tourism value chain. I was really intrigued by this. It's not something I've ever read about or heard about before. I'm hoping you could explain what the tourism value chain is and why it's important that travelers are informed about it. Basically,
the more money tourists spend and the more money stays in a region, the more value is added for that destination. There's this concept called tourism leakage, and it happens when an international company provides your hotel, your flight, your rental car, your excursions. It happens when you eat imported food or dine at at an international restaurant. All that money leaves the country. In the tourism value chain, ourselves as travelers being part of that chain, we need to be mindful that there's never a scenario where it's possible, to 100%. But if we're mindful, we can at least have a greater impact at having more percentage of every dollar that we spend in a community that stays in that community, in order to reduce leakage. And so that includes seeking out locally owned hotels, locally owned tour operators, locally owned restaurants. There's always going to be a certain degree of leakage, a certain level of, funds that are leaving a community. But if we're mindful, we can at least help reduce the impact. If we are, and I'm speaking specifically about when we travel to international destinations and developing countries, but we can have the greatest impact on poverty alleviation in developing countries, when we're mindful about where our dollar is being spent and being mindful about having that dollar actually stay in the community rather than leaving the community through foreign ownership of hotels and restaurants and car hire.
So it's a term for describing the practice of ensuring that your tourism dollars actually bring value to the host community rather than leaving the country.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, no, that's a great term for it. Because we've talked about this concept on the show, like plenty of times, like about how important it is to make sure you spend your tourism dollars in the communities that you're visiting and making sure that those dollars actually benefit those communities. But I just think this term is such a great descriptor for it. So I'm going to use this moving forward.
And there's a way that we can look at our travel, like our travels in some ways can be our form of giving back. When we are mindful about where that money is spent and where we are mindful about keeping those funds within the community that we spend them.
Do you have tips for how people can assure that? Because I think sometimes it can be really hard. Like you're looking at a hotel website and they might do a good job of disguising who actually owns the hotel.
Ask questions, that's number one as travelers, we need to ask the hard questions. We should be able to ask a hotel or a restaurant, what's your social responsibility? What are you doing for the community? How does your business impact the community? And if they have something in place, they should be able to answer that question fairly easily. If nothing is in place, then, there's going to be a stutter and they're not going to be able to, answer that question. It's difficult, to really know, for 100%, that your money is going, where people say that it's going. Really, the best advice that I have for people is just, ask the difficult questions, have a set of checks and balances, and, just try and get the answers that you're looking for. All we can do is our best.
Yeah, it brings to mind an episode that we did a couple seasons back. We interviewed a woman who has a tourism company in Mongolia, and she was telling us that she didn't share much information on the website for the company about sort of like who was running the company and the checks and balances going on in the background. And she said one day she got this email from someone just asking a couple questions about like their practices and is it locally owned? And it gave her this like realization that she should just share all of this information on the site and be transparent about it. So I thought that was like really interesting. And now that you're making this point, it's like maybe if more people start asking these questions, more companies will see value in like sharing that information up front.
I think what people are going to, or tour operators are going to see is that it's actually good for business. When they are, locally owned and operated, when they can prove, that they're sourcing locally, if tourists really want this and tourists demand this, then it'll be delivered, and I think what research has showed as well is that tourists are willing to pay, like a premium for that, just to know that, that their dollars are helping the local community. They often, hit obstacles, in not being able to find, enough ways to give back. But this is a great way for us to give back, is when our hoteliers and our restaurants and, our tour operators can show us as travelers that this is where the money is going. We have a certain percentage of locally hired employees and, we source our fruits and vegetables locally. And that's a great step forward. And I think it's, in terms of marketing, I think it's great for business as well.
So I know through making the film, you've had the chance to talk to people involved in tourism all over the world. And I'm curious, having had the chance to speak with so many local people in so many diverse destinations, I'm wondering if you've gathered a pulse or a feeling about how people in global communities are feeling about travelers visiting their communities.
This is a great question. And it's not a one size fits all, and from my research, what we discovered was that, tourism ultimately, it's a recreational pursuit for people like you and I who come from Canada. But in the developing world, it's a tool to alleviate poverty in many circumstances. And not all communities want tourism. We need to remember that it's their right to decide if they want to leverage tourism as a tool for their community. And if so, we need to allow them to define what success looks like. And that's not something that should be imposed by outside capitalists and outside tour operators. And, that's something that needs to be done from within. And we can't say that tourism is sustainable and responsible unless those factors are met. It's the community themselves that have made that decision to use tourism as a tool. And they're the ones who get to decide what success looks like.
And I guess a lot of it has to do also with sort of the infrastructure that's already in place and like the government policies that are in place to protect those communities. Because I think like what I've noticed sometimes is like communities will start out enjoying tourism and it'll bring lots of benefits, but then it'll spill into like the territory of over tourism where the harms start setting in, and then it sort of snowball effects until it's just not a benefit anymore.
Absolutely. And that's why destination management is so important. At the beginning, on the surface level, the promises of tourism are wonderful. And I would use cruise ship ports, like in the Caribbean as examples. When cruise ships approach these places in Jamaica or the Cayman Islands or Haiti, the promise of tourism, the promise of, foreign dollars and job increase, coming to their communities is wonderful, but there is a threshold, and how much is too much? How many people are too many people, or what types of tourists are coming into, and what demands are they making? I think in the news right now, we're seeing a lot of news from Playa del Carmen and Tulum in terms of, foreign tourists. There's a large problems with the drug cartels in the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico right now. The drug cartels are fighting over territory because tourists are demanding drugs when they, travel to these regions. And so tourists ultimately have created a host of unintended consequences and unintended problems, which has resulted in, a lot of corruption, murder in this area. And that was never the intent when, Mexico decided to designate this area, as a tourist region. But now we're seeing some very negative impacts because it's just gotten out of hand.
Yeah, and then the irony of that is like the media here in Canada tells Canadians not to go to Mexico because it's dangerous.
Yeah.
And yet we've caused the problem. Yeah, I wanted to talk a bit about the look of the film because it's gorgeous. The cinematography just really makes you feel a sense of amazement at how beautiful our planet is. Watching it really made me think of the BBC travel shows that I watched growing up that played a big part in making me personally really interested in seeing the world. And I think the beauty of the cinematography creates a sort of conflict for viewers that's really interesting because the film makes you want to travel and see these places, but at the same time, you're being forced to grapple with the impact that your travels could have there. So yeah, I'm assuming there was purpose in this conflict, but I wanted to ask you about it and see what you think.
We wanted to demonstrate at the same time that we're pulling back the curtain on our on the impacts of our travel choices. We never wanted to lose, just the fact of how wonderful and beautiful and rich travel can be. And, and when you talk about the conflict, I think, you've hit the nail on the head right there, because tourism is a conflict. For every good, there's a potential negative. If we're able to do tourism right, there's a beauty and a richness that's unmatched. And we didn't want that to be lost in the film, which is why we chose to, have some very beautiful cinematic landscapes.
Mm-hmm. I also think there's a benefit to it where you might draw in some viewers. We call them, Katie and I sometimes use the phrase casual travelers, like people who just aren't really thinking about the impact of travel. They might just accidentally click your documentary and think they're going to just see some beautiful landscapes. And then boom, they're learning about the impact of their travels.
Well, we also want to entertain. We don't want people just to turn on the film and just be bombarded with, a series of statistics, but we want to tell, real life, meaningful stories of, individuals, who live in communities that are being impacted by tourism. And, part of the story, of these individuals is the environment that they live in.
So there's a quote in the film where the narrator says, "We as tourists have lost the plot." And this is a theme that connects throughout the entire movie. And there's a lot of emphasis on what individual travelers can do to travel in a more responsible way. So things like doing your own research and being conscious of where your tourism dollars go as you're traveling. These are all things that we talk about as well on this show. But I do find, especially lately, that I feel a bit conflicted about these messages, just because it puts so much pressure on individual travelers. So in your research into the tourism industry, did you come across any industry level solutions that could also contribute to a more responsible tourism model? And just to expand a little bit, putting the pressure on individual travelers in situations where there's systemic issues at play, that in some situations, my choice to stay in an eco-friendly hotel, will it really have impact when really it should be the entire system shifting over to more eco-friendly practices?
Well, solutions happen on two levels. They happen from policies that are enacted by governments and from destination management organizations. And they also happen on a foundational individual level with the traveler. It's my feeling that, that real change will happen when we have governments and destination management on side. It's larger sweeping policies, that are going to have the real change, and if we use elephant riding in northern Thailand, for example, if one person says, if one traveler goes to Thailand and they say, well, I'm not going to ride an elephant, there's a very small positive impact, from a decision like that. But really, where if we really want to have lasting systemic change, the change really needs to come from the Thai government in, making a blanket ban on all elephant riding or, elephant tourist activities. There is a place for both of that. So yes, pressure does need to be put on governments and destination management organizations. And then pressure also needs to be put on travelers. And I think that they're also connected. We have seen, ground being broken, because we look at a company like TripAdvisor, who's one of the world's largest booking websites. Several years ago, they made a blanket ban on, wildlife activities, being booked through their websites. You cannot book, an elephant experience through TripAdvisor. And that's a really wonderful step forward. But the reason why TripAdvisor did that is because there was demands being placed on them from travelers saying that, that we demand a more ethical social responsibility from our booking agents. And that was ultimately delivered. The message of our film is geared towards the tourist, but that doesn't let, governments and DMOs off the hook. There's still a lot of responsibility, and we still have a lot of work to do, to put pressure on them to make sweeping policy changes.
Mm-hmm. And of course, more awareness is always a good thing because, I guess the one power that we have is our dollar and consumer demand. And I know when we talked with Natasha Daly, who's a journalist who has covered elephants and other wildlife tourism, she had told us that consumer demand really did help shift things in Thailand slightly away from riding. So I guess there is power in that because when tourists stop asking for it, it'll stop being offered.
It starts with us. It doesn't end with us, but it certainly starts with us.
So one criticism that I've experienced in the quote unquote responsible tourism space is people saying, why are you traveling if you know how bad it is for the planet? It's a fair criticism that I've grappled with personally. It's tough though, because I'm aware of the harms of travel, but I also know how much good can come from travel. I think personally that it's about finding balance and trying to tip the scales so that tourism has more of a positive impact than a bad one. So in the documentary, it's mentioned that tourism is going to continue to grow. And with tourism growing the way it is, and with travel becoming more and more accessible to more people, do you have any concerns about the direction that the industry is going to go in the coming years? Do you think that we're headed in a good direction, or are you concerned that things will continue to go towards the more harmful models of tourism?
I believe that both are going to happen. I'm really excited that that responsible travel is a theme that a lot more people are engaging in, and that, a younger generation and millennials are very interested in. That's a positive sign. Now, if we put it into perspective, this is, from my observation, it is also a conversation that's primarily being had in Western countries. And so, it's not an uncommon conversation to have in Canada and the US and different European nations and Australia. But I'm not convinced that this conversation is happening yet in a country like China. And to put things in perspective, China is, one of the largest countries in the world. Less than 10% of Chinese have passports. On the flip side, over 70% of Canadians hold passports and can travel. What we're seeing in China right now is, a huge growth in middle class and a large growth in people, of Chinese travelers traveling abroad. Now, the amount of Chinese travelers is just eclipsing, what the numbers of people leaving from our country. And so one of my fears is that with the growing middle class in China and with the growing amount of international travelers coming from China, it's very important that they have these conversations about responsible tourism. And I know that we're currently seeing some devastating effects in certain communities in Cambodia, where they're seeing a huge influx of Chinese travelers. But it's my observation that China, the people from China are not yet having these in-depth conversations about what it means to be a responsible traveler. It's up to us, because we're all part of this global travel community, to not wait another 30 years before this conversation is had.
Mm-hmm. It needs to be more of a global goal, and maybe there needs to be more collaboration on a global scale between all travelers, regardless of where they're going, for this to actually make a difference.
Absolutely. And there, but again, like there comes challenges with that, in terms of, just cultural differences and language barriers. And it's a massive challenge. I know, I mean, I'm very confident and I'm optimistic about it, but I just know that it's going to be a large hurdle for us to overcome within, in the coming decades.
So to build on that last question, one of the reasons I think it's not reasonable to argue that people should stop traveling is because I know that that would never happen. Like you say, the tourism industry is only going to grow. And humans have always been explorers. We seem to have always had this drive to travel. And because of this, I think it's just completely unrealistic that we would ever just like full stop. So I guess what I'm saying is I don't think there will ever be a last tourist. So on that note, I wanted to ask what message you were hoping to send by naming the documentary The Last Tourist.
I want to draw a distinction, between a traveler and a tourist. A tourist is somebody who, goes abroad and is there for themselves, is there to be served and catered to, isn't being mindful of, the contributions that they're making to that country. A traveler, on the other hand, is somebody who's more mindful, is somebody who's part of a community, is making decisions that have neutral or positive impacts on the environment, on wildlife, and on the communities that they visit. And so the idea behind naming the film The Last Tourist is because the idea of a tourist, we feel has to end. The idea of a tourist traveling to a destination and having it all be about themselves and what they can gain, and not thinking of the community or the greater good. That idea has to end. We need to be more mindful, responsible, respectful travelers.
Okay, cool. It's funny you say this because I actually was interviewed on a show recently and they asked me, like, do you think there's a difference between a traveler and a tourist? And I said no. I'll tell you why, though, because I was just saying, like, the way that I've heard that distinction made, like in the travel community often, is not about this framework of like a traveler being a more mindful tourist. It's more that, a traveler travels in a specific way that's like, I don't do resorts, I don't do this, I don't do that. And it's sort of like a holier than thou framework that doesn't have so much to do with like responsible tourism. And there's sort of this like thing where people don't want to be a tourist. And my whole argument was like, actually the terms mean the same thing. Like when it comes down to it, regardless, like you're a guest in another person's country. So that's how I was thinking about it. But I do like the way you framed it, especially in the context of the film. Thank you.
Yeah. And I think that, one of the most meaningful lines in the film, I think you sort of just summarized it right there, is that we need to remember always that we are guests in somebody else's home. And, we need to act, when we visit other communities abroad, we need to act in a way that, reflects our respect for that place, just as if we'd enter the home of a friend or a family member in our own community.
Okay, so to wrap up, we always like to ask everyone who comes on Alpaca My Bags for an insider tip. I can't remember where you're based. Are you in Vancouver?
I'm in Vancouver.
Okay. So could you share a favorite local activity, shop, restaurant, experience from Vancouver that our listeners can go try out for themselves?
I have friends that come to Vancouver for the first time, and I kind of send them the same list of things that I really enjoy. But if anybody's coming to Vancouver, my favorite activity is to head down to Denman Street and rent a bicycle and to ride the Stanley Park seawall and False Creek seawall. That's one of my favorite views and favorite activities in Vancouver. And it's environmentally friendly, and yeah, you get to, you can sample some local restaurants and you can see some beautiful views of Vancouver. But that's probably my favorite activity, when friends visit from out of town.
Oh, I love it. I'm a big cyclist, so I'll definitely be doing that next time I'm in Vancouver. Where can listeners find your film and learn more about you?
You can learn more about the film and watch the trailer through our social channels, Instagram and Twitter, @TheLastTouristFilm. You can also visit our website, www.thelasttouristfilm.com. You can find me on Instagram and Twitter, @Tyson Sadler. And also at my website, tysonsadler.com.
Thanks for listening to the show. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to share it with a fellow traveler. Make sure you're following us on all your favorite podcast apps. And if you're feeling extra generous, you can leave us a 5-star review or support us on Patreon. Anything you can do to support this show will help to foster meaningful change throughout the travel industry. Curious Tourism, the Responsible Travel Podcast, is written and hosted by me, Erin Hines, and it's produced and edited by Katie Lohr in Canada's Toronto area. Our theme music is called Night Stars by Wolf Saga, David R. Miracle, and the Chippewa Travelers. If you want to reach out to us, check the show notes for all the info you need. I'll see you in 2 weeks, but in the meantime, stay curious.